Your father left everything to me. You are not on the deed. You are not in the will. You have 48 hours to collect whatever fits in your car, and then I am changing every lock in this house. That is exactly what my stepmother said to me in the driveway of the home I grew up in, while the catering company was still packing up the trays from my father's reception. She didn't whisper it. She said it loud enough for the neighbor's teenage son, who was raking leaves 3 houses down, to hear every word. She was wearing a black dress that was just a little too fitted for a funeral, and she had her phone in one hand and a glass of white wine in the other. She had barely touched the coffee at the reception, but she had found the wine fast enough. I looked at her for a long moment. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I said, "Okay, Claire," and I walked back inside. She thought that was the end of it. She thought I was just another soft, grieving daughter who would fold under pressure and disappear quietly. She had completely miscalculated who she was dealing with, and she would spend the next 3 weeks paying for that mistake in ways she had not even begun to imagine. My father built Mercer Drafting and Design from a single rented office and a second-hand drafting table. By the time I was in college, it had grown into a mid-sized architectural firm with 14 employees, 3 major municipal contracts, and a reputation that had taken 30 years to earn. He was the kind of man who kept paper records of everything, who called his accountant every quarter, who still used the same attorney he had hired when I was in the 3rd grade. He was methodical, careful. He did not leave things to chance, which was why, when I was home over Thanksgiving 4 years ago and he asked me to sit down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, I paid close attention. He slid a document across the table. It was a thick packet, tabbed and highlighted in yellow. At the top, in clean serif font, it read, Mercer Family Revocable Living Trust. He walked me through it quietly, with the same calm voice he used when he was explaining anything important. He told me that everything he owned, the house, the firm, the investment accounts, had been transferred into the trust. He told me that he was the trustee while he was alive and mentally competent. He told me that I was the successor trustee, which meant that the moment he was incapacitated or gone, the authority to manage every asset in that trust passed to me, not to anyone else. I asked him why he was telling me this now. He looked out the kitchen window for a moment before he answered. He said he had met someone, and he liked her. But he had been around long enough to know that liking someone and trusting them with 30 years of work were 2 very different things. He married my stepmother 14 months later. She was 12 years younger than him, cheerful in the way that people are cheerful when they are trying hard to be liked, and she had a way of making my father laugh that I had not heard since my mother left when I was 9. I wanted to like her. I genuinely tried. But there was something in the way she moved through the house, the way her eyes landed on things, the original artwork in the hallway, the vintage credenza in the study, the architectural models my father had kept on a shelf in his office that reminded me less of a person making a home and more of a person taking inventory. My father's diagnosis came 18 months after the wedding, glioblastoma, stage 4. The oncologist did not give us false hope, and my father did not ask for it. What he asked for was time, and he used the time he had to keep working, to keep his employees paid, and to make sure his affairs were exactly as he wanted them to be. My stepmother changed during those 18 months. The cheerfulness went first. What replaced it was something harder and more purposeful. She started attending his meetings with the accountant. She started asking questions about the firm's contracts that had nothing to do with caring for a sick husband and everything to do with calculating a number. She hired a man she introduced as a financial wellness consultant, someone she said she had found through a friend, someone who was going to help her understand her options going forward. His name was Derek. He was 41, broad-shouldered, and had the particular kind of confidence that comes from having said convincing things to people who were too distracted or too frightened to check his credentials. I noticed that Derek came to the house on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, which were the afternoons I was not there. I noticed that my father, who was increasingly exhausted and on a rotating schedule of medications that left him foggy by 3 in the afternoon, had signed several documents that Derek had brought over in a leather portfolio. When I asked my father what he had signed, he said Claire had explained it to him and that it was fine. When I asked my stepmother what the documents were, she said they were financial planning instruments, routine things, nothing for me to worry about. I worried. The week my father died, I had barely slept. I had been at the hospital every day, sitting with him through the afternoons when he was still lucid enough to recognize me, holding his hand through the evenings when he was not. My stepmother came in the mornings, spent an hour, and left. I noticed that she had started wearing a bracelet I had never seen before, a heavy gold cuff with an engraving along the inside edge. It was not the kind of thing she would have bought herself. It looked antique, It looked like something from my father's house. He died on a Tuesday at 4 in the morning. I was there. She was not. By Thursday afternoon, she was meeting with a real estate agent in the driveway. I watched from the upstairs window as she walked the agent around the exterior of the house, pointing at the lot line, gesturing toward the garage. She was animated. She was smiling. She had not smiled at the hospital in weeks, but she was smiling now, and the agent was nodding and writing things down on a clipboard, and I stood at the window and felt something settle inside me that was colder and steadier than grief. I did not confront her. I went downstairs, said I needed some air, got in my car, and drove directly to the office of my father's attorney. Martin Okafor had been practicing law since before I was born. His office smelled like old paper and coffee, and his handshake was the kind that made you feel like things might actually be all right. I had called ahead, and when I walked in, he already had a file open on his desk. He took off his reading glasses, set them on top of the folder, and looked at me with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this conversation for some time. I told him about Derek. I told him about the documents. I told him about the real estate agent in the driveway 2 days after the funeral. I told him about the bracelet. He nodded slowly through all of it. Then he opened the folder and slid a single page across the desk. It was a summary sheet for the Mercer Family Revocable Living Trust. He tapped the line that listed the successor trustee, my name. He told me what that meant in plain language, the way my father had always asked him to. It meant that the house was not my stepmother's to sell. The firm was not hers to liquidate. The investment accounts were not hers to access. She had been named in my father's will as the beneficiary of his personal property, his clothing, his car, his personal bank account, which held a modest sum for day-to-day expenses. Everything else, the real estate, the business, the brokerage accounts, everything of real value, had been placed in the trust years before he ever met her. She had no authority over any of it. I asked Martin what the documents Derek had brought to the house might have been. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's what I'd like to find out." The next morning, I went back to the house while my stepmother was out. I still had a key. I went to my father's study and I found what I was looking for in the third drawer of his filing cabinet, behind a hanging folder labeled Miscellaneous. There were 3 documents. 2 were consent forms for something described as an asset consolidation strategy. They were dated 6 weeks before my father died, during a period when his medication had been increased significantly. The third was a limited power of attorney narrow in scope, but specifically granting Derek authorization to act on my father's behalf in connection with the firm's outstanding receivables. My father's signature on all 3 documents was thin and unsteady in a way his handwriting had never been before the medications. It was the handwriting of a man who could barely hold a pen. I photographed everything with my phone and put the originals back exactly where I found them. There was one more thing I was looking for. My father had kept a backup drive in a hollowed-out copy of Architectural Graphic Standards on the second shelf. It had been there for years, a habit from before cloud storage, something he maintained out of stubbornness and routine. I pulled the book from the shelf. The drive was still there. I pocketed it and left. That night, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop and a glass of water I forgot to drink, I plugged in the drive. It contained, among other things, 3 months of security footage from the cameras my father had installed throughout the house and office. He had mentioned once, almost in passing, that he had added cameras to the study after a contractor had gone through his desk while he was out. I had forgotten about it until that moment. I did not have to scroll far. The footage from 5 weeks before his death showed Derek sitting at my father's desk while my father dozed in the armchair by the window. My stepmother stood beside Derek, leaning over his shoulder, watching him fill out the documents. At one point, she walked to the armchair and touched my father's shoulder. He stirred. She spoke to him, and though the audio was not perfect, I could hear her clearly enough. She told him this was the paperwork Martin had requested. She told him it was just signatures, nothing complicated. My father nodded and reached for the pen she handed him. Martin had not requested anything. I put my headphones on and turned the volume up as high as it would go. After my father signed and closed his eyes again, Derek picked up the documents and said something to my stepmother. She laughed. She said, "He'll never read it." Derek said, "Even if he does, it doesn't matter. By the time anyone figures out what the POA covers, we'll have already moved the receivables into the holding account," my stepmother said. "And then we list the house." Derek said, "And then we list the house." I took my headphones off. I sat very still for a moment. Then I picked up my phone and called Martin. He answered on the second ring. I told him what I had found. There was a silence on his end that lasted long enough for me to count my own heartbeat. Then he said, in a voice that was very controlled and very deliberate. Don't do anything yet. Come to my office first thing tomorrow and bring everything. We spent 4 hours in his conference room the next morning. By the end of it, the picture was complete. Derek had used the limited POA to redirect 4 outstanding client invoices, totaling approximately $230,000, into a business account that was registered in his name. The money had been moved in 3 transfers over the course of 10 days, each transfer just small enough to avoid automatic bank scrutiny. My stepmother knew. The footage proved it. She had been present for every conversation, every document, every decision. Meanwhile, she had moved forward with the real estate listing. The house was now officially on the market. The listing had gone live 2 days before, asking price just under $2 million. She had also made contact, through Derek, with a buyer who had expressed interest in acquiring the firm's client list and active contracts, essentially the operational core of Mercer, drafting and design for a negotiated sum. Martin looked at me across the conference table. He said we could go to the police immediately. He said we could file for an emergency injunction, freeze the accounts, and have her removed from the property within the week. I shook my head. I told him I wanted to wait. He gave me the same look he had given me 30 years ago when I was 8 years old, and I told him I wanted to wait to open my birthday present until everyone was seated. A look of patient amusement mixed with something like admiration. I told him what I was thinking. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he opened his desk drawer and pulled out a notepad. He said, "Tell me exactly what you need." What I needed was a buyer. Not a real one. A corporation. Something clean and professional that would not raise suspicion. A name that sounded institutional. A letterhead that looked expensive. An email address from a domain that resolved to a real website with real boilerplate language about real estate acquisition and portfolio investment. Martin had relationships with a title company that handled high net worth privacy transactions. They were familiar with the kind of arrangement I was describing. Within 24 hours, we had a corporate entity called Ridgeline Capital Partners and an email address that routed through a law firm server. We sent an inquiry to the real estate listing. We expressed interest in a quick, clean transaction. We mentioned that our acquisition team was under time pressure due to a tax structure deadline and that we preferred to move fast with minimal back and forth. We mentioned a number that was 10% below asking, which was low enough to feel like a real negotiation and high enough to be taken seriously. We sent the same inquiry, slightly modified, to Derek's email regarding the firm. The reply to the house inquiry came in 40 minutes. My stepmother was very interested in Ridgeline Capital Partners. The reply regarding the firm came in 3 hours, from Derek, saying that his client was open to discussing terms and asking when we could schedule a call. Martin looked at me across his desk. "She's moving fast," he said. "She knows she's on a clock." "Let her move," I said. "Let her think she's almost across the finish line." We let the negotiation run for 5 days. We let her counteroffer. We let Derek push back on the firm valuation. We let them feel the momentum of something that was about to close. On the morning of the 6th day, we confirmed a closing date. The house, the firm, both transactions, same day, structured as simultaneous closings to satisfy Ridgeline's portfolio acquisition timeline. Total combined value, $2.9 million, to be received via wire transfer at closing. The closing was held at a title company on a Thursday morning in November. The sky outside was low and gray in the way that November skies in the Midwest always are, flat and colorless and pressing down on everything. I was not in the building. I was parked across the street in a rental car I had taken, specifically so my stepmother would not recognize the vehicle. Watching a live feed on my phone from a camera pinned to the lapel of the title officer who was coordinating the transaction. Martin had arranged it. The title officer's name was Susan, and she had a voice like someone who had spent decades telling people exactly what they were signing without letting them feel rushed. She was, Martin had assured me, very good at her job. My stepmother arrived 12 minutes early. She was dressed well, a charcoal blazer, heels, her hair pulled back in a way that said, "I have somewhere important to be after this." Derek arrived 3 minutes later in a sport coat that still had the dry cleaning tag tucked into the breast pocket. They sat down across from Susan and the closing coordinator, and they looked exactly like two people who believed they were about to receive a very large wire transfer. The documents were thick. Susan walked through them methodically, page by page, the way she always did. She noted the parties, the property description, the transfer amounts. She asked my stepmother to confirm her identity and her authority to convey the property. My stepmother said yes, she was the owner of record. Susan set a pen on the table and asked her to sign where indicated. My stepmother signed the house over to Ridgeline Capital Partners without hesitation. Derek signed the firm documentation immediately after. Susan said the wire would be confirmed within the hour. She thanked them for their time. That was when the door opened. I walked in with Martin behind me, and behind Martin were two men who carried themselves the way that people do when they have a specific and unambiguous purpose, and no particular interest in how the room feels about it. One of them was a detective from the Financial Crimes Unit, who Martin had briefed 2 days earlier. The other was a federal agent who had become very interested in the POA documents and the redirected client invoices once Martin made a phone call to a contact he had maintained for 20 years. My stepmother looked at me the way that people look at something they were certain was no longer a problem. Her expression moved through surprise and then through calculation and landed somewhere that was trying very hard to look like indignation. She said my name. She said, "You have no right to be here. This is a legally executed transaction." I let Martin speak first. He set a copy of the Mercer Family Revocable Living Trust on the table in front of Susan. He explained, in the clear and unhurried way that very competent attorneys explain things when they have the complete advantage, that every asset my stepmother had just signed over to Ridgeline Capital Partners had been held in an irrevocable trust structure since 4 years prior to my father's death. The house was a trust asset. The firm was a trust asset. My stepmother had never held the legal authority to sell, transfer, mortgage, or convey either one of them. The deed of record had been titled to the trust, not to her personally, and any title search conducted with appropriate diligence would have confirmed this immediately. The fact that no title search had been conducted with appropriate diligence was a problem for Derek, who had represented to the closing coordinator that the title was clear. She did not have legal standing to sign what she had just signed, which meant the transaction was void, which meant the wire transfer confirmation she was expecting was not coming, which also meant that every document she had just executed was now evidence. My stepmother looked at Derek. Derek looked at the federal agent. The federal agent looked at his notebook. She said it was a misunderstanding. She said she had been advised that she was the rightful heir. She said she had relied on counsel. She turned to Derek when she said the last part, and Derek took a very small, very deliberate step backward. The detective put a folder on the table. He explained that the redirected client invoices constituted wire fraud under federal statute. He explained that the POA had been obtained under fraudulent pretense, specifically the misrepresentation to my father, who was cognitively impaired due to documented end-stage medication protocols at the time of signing, that the document had been requested by his attorney. He explained that the security footage, which had been reviewed and authenticated, placed both my stepmother and Derek in the room when that misrepresentation occurred. My stepmother's voice lost its shape a little. She said she had not known what Derek was doing with the invoices. Derek said, with the focused energy of a man who has just realized his primary strategy is to not be the last person holding everything, that this was not his understanding of the arrangement. The detective said that was something they could discuss at the station. Martin asked Susan to note in the transaction record that the closing had been halted prior to fund disbursement due to a title dispute and potential fraud matter under investigation. Susan, who had the expression of someone who had seen many things in her career and had strong feelings about people who wasted her Thursday mornings, made the notation without comment. My stepmother looked at me one more time. She said I had no idea what I was doing to her. She said my father would have wanted her taken care of. She said she had given up years of her life for him. I had been thinking about what I would say if she said something like that. I had run through a number of versions in my head over the preceding days, but when the moment came, I found that I didn't need any of them. There was only one thing I actually wanted to say. I said, "He did take care of you, Claire. He left you the car and the personal account and every piece of clothing and furniture in that house that wasn't a trust asset. That was what he decided to give you. He was careful and deliberate, and he thought it through, and that was his decision." I paused. "You just wanted more than he chose to give." She didn't say anything after that. The accounts were frozen before the end of the business day. The $230,000 Derek had redirected was recovered in full through a civil judgment that moved faster than most because the evidence was exceptionally clean. The criminal investigation moved on a parallel track. I did not attend those proceedings. Martin kept me informed, and that was enough. The house was mine. The firm was mine. I walked through the front door on a Saturday morning 3 weeks later, and I stood in my father's study and looked at the shelf where architectural graphic standards still sat in its place, and I thought about him sitting at this desk for 30 years, building something worth protecting, being careful enough to protect it even from his own blind spots. I found the bracelet in the dresser drawer in the master bedroom, the gold cuff with the engraving on the inside edge. I turned it over and read the inscription. It was my father's mother's name and a date from 1962. It had been my grandmother's. My father had kept it in a cedar box in his closet for as long as I could remember. I put it in my jacket pocket and carried it with me when I locked the house and walked to my car. There is a particular kind of grief that lives alongside relief, and it is stranger than grief alone. Sitting in my car in that driveway, I felt both of them at the same time, pressing against each other in my chest. I missed my father with a specific and physical weight that I understood was not going away anytime soon. But underneath it, and around it, was something that was not quite peace and not quite satisfaction, but was closer to both of those things than I had expected to feel so soon. My father had been careful. He had sat at a kitchen table 4 years before he died and made sure that what he built would go where he intended it to go. He had not been naive about the risks. He had looked at them clearly, the way he looked at everything, and he had made a plan. He had told me about the plan. He had trusted me with it. I started the car and sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel. Then I drove back to the firm, unlocked the front door, turned on the lights in the drafting room, and sat down at his old desk. There were 14 employees who had shown up for work every day through the uncertainty of the past months, and they deserved to know that the work was continuing. There were 3 active municipal contracts that needed attention. There was an accounting review that needed to be scheduled. There was a whole structure that my father had spent 30 years building, and it was intact, and it was mine to carry forward. I pulled the backup drive from my bag, plugged it into the desktop, and got to work. Sometimes the people who think they are taking everything from you have no idea what you actually have. They see the house, the account numbers, the business name on the door. They do not see the trust document in the filing cabinet. They do not see the backup drive behind the book on the shelf. They do not see what 30 years of careful work leaves behind in the hands of the person who was chosen to hold it. They mistake patience for weakness every single time. And every single time, that is the last mistake they make.